Welcome to Ministry Mondays with Meg. I'm Meg. I am Reverend Meg Biddle. I currently serve as the National Coordinator for Ministry Life and the American Baptist Personnel Services. And I'm located in the Leadership and Mission Building in King of Prussia. Thank you for joining us today. Today I am joined by my friend and colleague, Morgan. Let's see if I can get your... Yeah, that was me. This is you. Morgan Bandy. Morgan, I met it's been a couple of weeks or so ago.
I think a week and a half.
Yeah,
2 weeks.
Like yeah. At the Prairie Pastors gathering in Omaha, and we connected, and I knew that I wanted to have her here and talk with me about ministry and what that is like for her today. Morgan, thanks so much for being here with me today. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Like Meg said, my name is Morgan Bandy. I am currently serving as the Communications and Finance Administrator for American Baptist Churches of the Central Region. Our office is in Topeka, Kansas. So I do all the kind of communication things, like send out emails about upcoming events. We have our newspaper called the Central Region Life. We have our online paper called The Focus. I do our mission money, and I just do anything that anyone kind of needs me to do. I do camping, so I direct our high school camp. And then I work with our 410 program, which is run by Reverend Jennifer Schneider, who's our Associate Executive Minister. I do 410, which is our young youth leadership training. And so I do some of that. I was previously serving I resigned in February as the family life pastor at First Baptist Church in Stillwell, Kansas. I was there for 4.5 wonderful years, really enjoyed my time. That's just a little bit about me. I am also an above-knee left leg amputee. I lost my left leg to Ewing sarcoma bone cancer when I was 8 months old. So I've been an amputee my whole life. I don't know any different. It's a challenge sometimes, but it's fun. There are some fun things that go about it. My family has a really twisted sense of humor. My mom, who was a high school youth leader when I was young, at the church that I grew up in, they did a haunted meat locker haunted house one Halloween as a fundraiser, and so she used some of my legs and covered them in fake blood. And when I was in 4th grade, I had surgery and couldn't wear my fake legs, so my mom made me a pogo stick and put little pegs on my head and pegs on my hips and baling wire up my right leg. So those are kind of the fun things that go about it. But there are some challenges. There are some. I'm learning now at the ripe old age of 25, almost 26, that there are some degenerative changes that have come with being a lifelong amputee, and I'm just now kind of learning about them and dealing with them. So that's been a challenge. There's so many other things. I really like bees and butterflies and flowers. I try to be literal sunshine to anyone I can be sunshine to. I really like interacting with people of all ages. And I just like, communicating with people. I like being present and there for other people.
Well, thank you for your introduction and for being so open about your experiences. I love your family's attitude. Their take on all of this. So let's talk a little bit about some of those challenges that you've experienced. First of all, you've served as a pastor for 4.5 years, pastor whose gender happens to be female. So there's that. Mm-hmm. And then add to that the amputee status. Talk about some of those challenges that you've faced there.
Yeah. Well, as any woman ministry knows, there are a handful, less than a handful of verses that do not affirm us as ministers of the word. And as we all know, people are going to take those and run with them any way they want. And there are certain denominations of churches. Thankfully, we're American Baptists, and so each church is autonomous, and we can, we affirm women in ministry. I grew up in the Church of Christ denomination, and so no women in ministry at all. You could serve as a Sunday school teacher for young kids, but that was about it. Other than that, you just sat in the pews and listened. So that's kind of the way I grew up. We did go to a Christian church where that was in my older life, where that was less common, where we had instruments in worship. And that's when my mom was a youth leader. So I did have some hints of women can do this, but it wasn't as much. And I have been in classes with professors who were not affirming of women in ministry. I've had family members who at the beginning were not affirming, who are coming around. And even if they're not super supportive of it, they support me and they love me the same. So they may not understand it, but it's something that we have to work through, and it's a generational thing as well. So it's kind of working on that. Also, there are just challenges as well as being young and a young woman, and I don't have a seminary degree yet, and so that has kind of built into it. But I just kind of taken everything with a grain of salt and know that, God called me to this, and I promise you that I would not be in ministry if God hadn't called me to it. Because it's not an easy thing, as anyone who's in ministry knows, that if you were not called, you definitely would not do it because it's hard. So there's part of that. And as an amputee, it's been hard to be in the church in general, because churches aren't made, we're not built for people with disabilities. Of any kind. They weren't made for people with physical disabilities or any sort of mental and emotional disabilities. So as a young kid, I didn't really notice a lot of it because I was still really, really active, and I did not really have limitations. There were a few, right? Like I could not get into the water with my leg on, which did make it hard at some things like camp. When there were water games, or it made it hard. Like if we would go to the pool, I'd have to take my leg off and hop. And so I was, kind of behind my friends. And so that was a little hard. But of course, I don't always listen. I was a young kid and I'm stubborn. So my doctors at the leg hospital that I went to, which was Texas Scottish Rite Hospital in Dallas, Texas, would say, Morgan, you can't get in the water. You can't get in the sand. And I said, okay, no problem. My next appointment, they would flip my leg upside down and water and sand just fall out of this leg. And they're like, Morgan, were you in the water and the sand? And because I was a child and lied, I said, no, of course not. I was. I remember that my mom had to come up to church camp one time to come fix my leg because it had rained so much that the ditches had overflowed and kids were running and swimming in the ditches. And I didn't want to be left out. So I went and swam in the ditches with my leg on, and then my leg wouldn't work correctly. So my mom had to drive all the way back up to church camp to fix it. But there's just things where it just made it a little bit harder. But now that I'm older, I'm just seeing more as my body changes, and I've become more aware of other people's disabilities, different abilities. I've just learned that churches are not always built that way, because a lot of these churches are really, really old, and so they didn't have to be built that way. And but I'm just thinking of churches with only steps. There are some churches that don't even have ramps still. And so you have to think about that. And so, churches really, really want people to come to their church and attend their church, but they don't have the accessibility to have some of those people come. And then there are just things like the pews. In Omaha, I was hurting a little bad because we were sitting in pews for a couple of hours, and I was realizing, I was like, oh, okay, this is where the degenerative changes come from. I'm starting to hurt a little bit. But then there are also different things for people with different disabilities, like people with autism. It's overwhelming. The worship is overwhelming. The sights, the sounds, the smells, depending on what kind of worship setting you're in, can be overwhelming. And then people react differently, right? Some people will make noises during worship, and able-bodied people are not always receptive to that, especially even if it's kids and there are kids with some sort of different ability. You know, they turn around and they like glare at the kid or glare at the parent, when really, like, everyone who enters as someone who is formed in the image of God. Even that child, even that person who can't sit through a whole sermon or can't without making a noise or getting up or what have you. Instead of judging that, and instead of thinking that person is not welcome, we need to think about ways that we can make our space of worship, more accessible to them, more comfortable for them. So there's stuff like that, but then there's also stuff like, you know, you and I had talked a little bit about prairie pastors, about someone who was in a wheelchair, and they were talking about meeting in a different space, and that space was not accessible. And they're like, well, he just won't come. Everyone else can come. And you said, no, that's, if he can't come, we're not coming. This space needs to be accessible for everyone. And I think that's really important. We can't have something where, we can, we do, but if we're going to have an event, we want this event to be open to everyone. We want worship to be open to everyone. So that may be having some monitors out in a more comfortable area for someone who can't sit in those hard pews or chairs. Where it needs to be, having monitors are a different way for people who can't handle the loud music of the band, or sometimes pastors, you know, will start really loud and then they'll yell, and that frightens some people. And just figuring out ways to make that more accessible, to make that more friendly to them. Everyone deserves to worship Jesus in their home church, wherever they call that. And we should try to figure out how to make it accessible to them. And I don't know how to do that yet, right? I'm still learning. There are things where I'm like, oh yeah, this is accessible to me, so it's accessible to everyone. And like, wait, actually, it's not accessible to this person. So then I have to step back and be like, okay, just because it's accessible to me and people like me can get in doesn't mean people like A, B, and C can get in. So it's looking at all different types of disabilities and running with it. And unfortunately, I don't know if we will ever be able to cater to everyone, right? Someone's always going to be upset. Someone's always going to feel like they're missing out on something. But I think as the church, we should try to figure some of those things out. Maybe we do a different service. I know for pastors, that's asking a lot. I know that, right? You don't want to have to do 6 different services a week, but maybe even once a month, try to figure out a service that is more inclusive to people with autism, people who have the inability to sit still during our service, or even just cater your service to where it's okay. If there is a kid who is making noises, right? Because that's a thing that a lot of kids do. They make noises or they cry or whatever. Don't rush to send that kid out of the room, right? Maybe as someone who doesn't have kids, you can go sit with that parent and help the other kids that they have while that parent takes care of that child. Or maybe you can I know that the church in Stillwell, they have these grab bags, and they've got some toys in them, and they've got some coloring books and stuff, even something like that, to where they're not just having to sit still. But there are also churches who have, children's church during the service, and those are good options too. But as those children get older and they're not, children's church age, we still have to figure out ways that they can be comfortable in worship. And then there are churches that are not handicap accessible at all. or they try to be handicap accessible, but it's really like poorly done. I was talking to a realtor recently about wanting a space that is handicap accessible. And he's like, well, it's not completely handicap accessible, but it can be accessible this way and doing this. He's like, and this is what this man said. He said, but what I've learned is people like you are extremely accommodating to stuff like that. And I thought that, and I was like, yeah, we are, but we shouldn't have to be. We, people with different abilities, should not have to be accommodating.
Right.
The world should accommodate for other people. I mean, the world is not built. Buildings are not built for people with different abilities.
Right.
When I was in undergrad, the building that most of my classes were in, the way you had to get to the building, you had to go upstairs and then upstairs, or you had to go upstairs and then downstairs. And I was in those classes, and I couldn't wear my prosthesis for a while, and I was in a wheelchair. And so I couldn't walk, but I could still hop. So what I'd do is I'd wheel myself to this class, and I would hop my wheelchair up or down these stairs to get to class. And after the first or second time of doing that, of course, people are like, here, let us help you. But college campuses are not built for people who are handicapped. And there are even dorms where, yeah, you can be in this dorm that's handicap accessible, but you have to pay so much more extra money.
So they didn't have elevators or anything?
No, there was only 2 buildings on campus, but none of the dorms on that campus, only one was handicap accessible, but it was the most expensive dorm.
That's terrible.
So and I finally got into that dorm after, pleading my case, and they let me, and we're very sorry that I had to go through that. But it shouldn't be because of a last resort. Even if, you have to pay a little extra money, that student should be able to be put in there. But that also shouldn't be the case, that you have to pay more to be accommodated.
Right.
And that's how it is. And you and I were talking previously about how even churches, it costs a lot of money to make these churches handicap accessible. And I understand that people who have any sort of handicap, have any sort of different ability, know that and understand that it's expensive. I mean, we're paying for our stuff, right? We're paying for our legs, for our wheelchairs, walkers. We understand that it's expensive. But there are ways, there are grants, there are ways that you can make your space accommodating. And I do know that a lot of people really have been thankful for online church. I mean, the pandemic opened up a whole new world of online church, and that has helped a lot, because if you can't go sit in a pew for an hour because you're in pain, you're able to watch it online. But of course, it comes with your own sort of judgment there. But I can say that as someone, I'm pretty accessible, right? I can walk most days without falling downstairs. I can, I play sports. I play sports with my friends. I'm pretty able-bodied, but there are times where it's hard to worship because I'm in pain. And so then that also affects, my spiritual life. And so I don't know, some people may be familiar or not familiar with disability theology. And that's something that I've been studying recently, talking about how, we're all made in the image of God, and we're all flawed because of sin, but because our flaws, anyone who is differently abled, are more visible, like we're seen as more broken than someone who is able-bodied. And so that's been something that I've learned a lot in my life. I've seen that. And I know that my mom is extremely stubborn and strong. She would probably prefer the word strong, but I'm going to say stubborn. She really had to deal with that when I was a kid, with a lot of people staring and judging. And I know that she told me this story about how the church that her and my dad attended, they attended different churches, but didn't want my mom and dad to go through with the amputation. They thought that they could pray the cancer away and all of that. And while I believe in prayer and I believe in miracles and the power of God, I also believe in science. I believe in medicine. And so that's something that, I've had to deal with in churches, where people are like, well, we're going to lay hands on you and we're going to ask the Lord to heal your body. Yes, please. But realistically, I also need to go to the doctor. I need medicine. I need physical therapy. So it's working with stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's been kind of tough. And then it's also the thought of, when we get to heaven, we're going to have these perfect bodies. Well, then what does that look like? Are you saying that because I'm going to be in heaven with 2 arms and 2 legs, that I was any less than someone who was on earth with 2 arms and 2 legs? So I think about that, and I don't hate my body. I don't hate that I'm an amputee. Is it hard? Absolutely. But I know that this is the way God intended for me, because God has used me as a vessel to share the gospel, as a vessel to do his work, without a leg. And sometimes I get a little mad at God. I'm like, really? You want me to do all this stuff? And I'm trying, but I hurt. Like, you got to help me out here. And then someone much wiser than me goes, Morgan, but because you're hurting, you're able to talk to a different group of people and relate to them and to share the gospel differently than I could. So I think about stuff like that. But I do think about, we are in a broken and sinful world. But that doesn't mean that we just have to deal with it. That doesn't mean that just because the world wasn't built for people like me, that we can't start building for people like me, that we can't start accommodating. I think of the story of the man whose friends lowered him into the roof, right? We shouldn't have to lower our friends into the roof to see Jesus. We shouldn't have to carry people into a sanctuary to worship the Lord. We should be able to build a ramp or get an elevator or find ways to make it happen. But because we are the Lord's people, until we make that happen, we will continue to lower them into the houses and into the roofs. But I would really like to see us having to do that less and being able to just worship together.
I think this is part of the reason we got along so well. You've brought up those conversations that we had. I am a mother of a autistic adult child, and also have been a pastor, and so it's all of these things that you're talking about. But I can also say, as the pastor, I would far rather the noise be there. What other people see as noise, I think of as life. So let the kids crawl around on the floor, and if a kiddo needs to pace, let him pace. I mean, my son was fine as long as he was sitting in the same pew, but God forbid somebody took his seat, the day was off. If they asked him to do things like help with offering, he was more than willing to do things like that. But sometimes it was assumed that because he had this disability that he wouldn't, or he wouldn't be interested. But no one ever asked. And so sometimes is that ask people, ask them. And I think it's so important that we tell these stories, and ones like I told you of the young man who there was no way. I mean, we were going to go to a church where people could not get in and out safely. I mean, being carried in a wheelchair is not only unsafe for the person being carried, for the person carrying them. I mean, that's demeaning. That's it. And last time I checked, people that were differently abled were loved by God the same as the rest of the world. So that's that's my soapbox. But when we talk about questions and conversations and things like that, what's a question that you wish people would ask you about being differently abled?
Yeah. One, just ask in general. Ask how, what, one thing that really gets me is children. Children are going to stare. They're going to stare at you if you have a mole on your face or if you've got a giant hunk of metal attached to your hip. You're going to stare. And I learned that at a really young age, that people are going to stare. Even adults stare. So then when I was able to make a decision, I decided that all of my legs were going to be colorful. I've had splatter paint. I've had sports teams. Currently, my leg is covered in bees. you're going to stare. And so, of course, I'm going to give someone to stare about. But for parents with little ones, please don't shield them from staring at me. Allow them to talk to me. And if you're worried about me being a stranger, I understand that. But it is so much easier for your child to then interact with other people with different abilities if they just meet one person who goes, yeah, this is what's happened. In the church, I work with kids, and it's the first question, what happened to your leg? And then I explain it to them, and it's never really a question again. And then if someone else comes in, they may ask what happened, why are you this way, but they're not going to just stare and gawk, or they're going to be like, hey, someone who's like Morgan. I have 3 young siblings, 6, 11, and almost 14. And they grew up with someone who, me, who is missing a limb, who is physically different. And so that, and because of who raised them, my mom, they don't stare at the kids who are different. They make a beeline to play with them, to see how they're doing, to eat lunch with them, because they know, just from my experience and them hearing my stories, that it can be hard. And so raise your kids to be those kids, let them ask the questions. And yeah, some of the questions are really silly, like asking if I'm a robot. And I always tell them, I really wish I was. Because if you're a robot, you don't feel the pain I feel. Ask the question, how, why, and then ask me like what I like about it, because there are things I like about it. I really like that it's patterned and that it can be colorful. And I really like that it makes me different than other people. I like, you and I talked about this. I was never the poster child, right? My mom never let me be the poster child for disability. And I loved her for that, because it let me just be me. But now that I'm older, I'm like, okay, well, I want to set myself apart a little bit differently, because I don't want younger kids like me, who were like me and they're younger now, to experience all of the things I can. So maybe if I can bring a little bit of awareness to it, they're not. There are some students who have different disabilities, and their parents say, hey, would you be willing to meet with them? Would you be willing to talk with them? And of course, 100% of the time, I absolutely would. And one of the things that I always tell them is let them be. They're going to get hurt. We are going to get hurt. You can keep us safe, but let us be kids. I remember growing up at the hospital, and these parents are spending thousands and thousands of dollars on these prosthetic limbs for their kids. But when we get to the playground, they had to take them off. And part of that is they're expensive. So I understand that, but let them be kids, let us, as people with different abilities, do what we want to do. Like, we know our own limits. You don't know our limits. If you're worried about our limits, ask. Be like, Morgan, what's your limit? That's another good question to ask. If you are asking me to do something, 90% of the time, I will tell you yes or no, I can't do this. Sometimes I'm stubborn and say I can do it, and then I'm hurting the next day. But that's my own fault. So ask us what our limits are, and most of the time we will tell you our limits. Now, there are people who are stubborn like I am, and again, I get that from my mother. But that is our own fault. We don't want to be left out of things, of worship. Like you said, no one asked your son if he wanted to serve communion or take up offering or pray, because no one asked him. So if you have someone in your church who is differently abled, ask them where their heart is. They have a heart for ministry in some way. They have a way they want to serve Jesus. Find ways that they can do that. Ask them how they would like to do that.
I would definitely love to have you come back and be part of a panel to talk about more about the disability theology. Definitely. I do want to make sure that we let everyone know, if they're not aware, that April is Limb Loss and Limb Difference Awareness Month.
Yep.
And so as we wrap up our conversation for today, I do want to ask you, what about your current ministry brings you the most joy?
Definitely connecting with people. I get phone calls all day long asking for help with, mission money. They have questions about that, or they need me to put something in the Central Region Life. It doesn't seem, like a big deal, But in that, I get to talk to other people. I get to go to places like Prairie Pastors Conference and eat lunch with wonderful people and learn about the ministry they're doing. I really like hearing about other people's ministries and ways I can help serve in their ministry. So there are a handful. I'm in the central region, which is Kansas, Oklahoma, and one church in Arkansas. And so what I love to do is put whatever that church is doing in our newspaper, share it on Facebook. We have churches who are doing incredible food ministries, who are doing incredible youth stuff, who are working with houseless people, and they do all of this stuff. And what I find the joy in is sharing that with other people and sharing just the incredible things that God is doing within our churches.
Morgan, I am so glad that I had the opportunity to meet you in person at Prairie Pastors, and that we've become friends, and that you were willing to share your story, at least a small part of it today. And I really do want to have you back to talk more about disability theology specifically. Yeah. So I thank everybody for watching this episode today. Our episodes come out every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am Reverend Meg Biddle, and today I was joined by my friend and colleague, Morgan Bandy from the Central Region. You can find our videos at Facebook, ABHMS on our Facebook page, or on YouTube at the ABHMS Facebook, or at the ABHMS channel on Facebook. So thank you for watching, and join us again next week.